He was the wild man of early country music, goggles, overalls, and a dobro slung across his chest like a lightning rod. Cousin Jody, born Cleo J, didn't just perform. He exploded onto stages, turning country comedy into an art form. He helped shape the very foundation of the Grand Ole Opry and brought laughter to homes across America. But while the cameras loved him, the industry wasn't always so kind. Behind the scenes, he was a deeply private man surrounded by swirling rumors, whispered betrayals, and strange disappearances. And then, one day, he was simply gone. No farewell tour, no obituary that matched the magnitude of his legacy, just a name that faded quietly from country music history. For decades, fans have wondered what really happened to Cousin Jody. Was it illness, poverty, or was something more sinister involved? Now, after years of speculation and long-buried evidence, the truth has finally surfaced. And what we've uncovered at the end of this investigation isn't good. In the golden age of country music, Cousin Jody was more than just a novelty act. He was an innovator. His showmanship bordered on outrageous, yet his musical ability was no joke. One of the earliest dobro players to bring the instrument to national attention, he fused comedy and craftsmanship in a way that was uniquely his. By the 1940s, he had carved a place for himself among the ranks of rising stars on the Grand Ole Opry. He shared stages with legends, played backup for Acuff, and earned respect not just as a character, but as a legitimate talent. Fans knew him for his wacky outfits and comedic timing, but industry insiders recognized a man who had paid his dues the hard way. Born Cleo J in North Carolina in 1914, his journey into music was paved with both triumph and tragedy. Early in his career, Cousin Jody found a home with the Loafers and Acuff's Smoky Mountain Boys. But as time went on, his outlandish persona began to eclipse the man behind it. His act grew more exaggerated, more cartoonish, even as his personal life became increasingly complicated. By the 1960s, while others were transitioning into crossover success and mainstream acclaim, Jody doubled down on his eccentric image. He wore bicycle goggles on stage. He danced in baggy clothes. He turned his performances into something between vaudeville and bluegrass. But behind that comic mask, friends said he was becoming increasingly reclusive and bitter. He felt typecast, trapped by the very image that had brought him fame. And worse, the business side of country music wasn't treating him kindly. As his popularity declined, so did his financial stability. Royalties were minimal. Publishing rights were frequently tangled in contracts Cousin Jody barely understood. Despite his decades of contributions to country music, he never owned much of anything. Not a home, not a studio, not even a reliable car in his later years. He lived modestly, often moving from place to place, depending on low-paying gigs and favors from old friends just to make ends meet. There were whispers of unpaid appearances, backroom deals that robbed him of earnings, and even legal threats from former managers who claimed ownership of his work. One former booking agent once told a Nashville reporter in confidence that Jody was one of the most exploited men in country music history. He never had children to carry on his legacy, and though he married once early in life, the union dissolved quickly. There were no surviving family members close enough to intervene in his final years. In the end, the man who had once made millions laugh was quietly cast aside, left to fade into obscurity. But the real mystery wouldn't be uncovered until years after his death, when someone finally asked the question, Why was Cousin Jody's name left out of so many country music Hall of Fame conversations? And what secrets were buried with him? As the years went by, Cousin Jody became something of a ghost in the halls of country music. While his peers were being celebrated at tribute shows, honored with induction speeches, and featured in retrospectives, Jody's name barely surfaced. His absence from major recognitions like the Country Music Hall of Fame wasn't just strange, it was deliberate. Researchers and historians who tried to dig into his later life were met with a troubling lack of records. No estate filings, no clear next of kin, no well-documented obituary beyond a few local blurbs. For someone who helped pioneer the comedic side of country performance, there were practically no efforts made to preserve or celebrate his contributions. It was almost as if someone, or something, had wanted his story to disappear. The closer you looked, the stranger it got. There were rumors that he died in a state of financial ruin. Some claimed he was evicted from the last home he lived in. Others said he had been staying in a trailer behind a bar in eastern Tennessee, trading performances for room and board. A few even whispered he had been institutionalized briefly in the years before his death, though no official medical records have ever confirmed it. What is confirmed is this: when Cousin Jody passed in 1975, it wasn't in the warm company of loved ones or under the spotlight of country fame. It was quietly, anonymously. He died in a Nashville hospital with only a nurse and a part-time caretaker listed on the chart. Even more chilling is what came afterward. When a local journalist attempted to write a retrospective on Jody's life in the early 2000s, they found that all attempts to access his financial records, contracts, and even some archived Opry performance reels were blocked or lost in transition. His name was listed incorrectly in multiple historical logs. Entire episodes of shows he'd appeared on were missing or damaged. It didn't make sense unless someone had gone to great lengths to erase parts of his legacy. One theory points to an old management group that once handled several acts from the Opry and had a history of bad contracts and legal loopholes. Several of their former clients sued in the late 80s for royalty theft and rights misappropriation. Cousin Jody's name wasn't on any of those lawsuits, but insiders believe that's only because he was already gone, and those contracts had already drained everything he had. One particularly damning memo, leaked decades later, lists Cousin Jody by name in connection to a lapsed royalties clause, a shady practice where an artist's payments would cease the moment they stopped performing regularly. This wasn't just neglect. This was quiet, strategic erasure. A man who helped build the stage for others was written out of the script. And as new voices in country began to rewrite the genre's history, Cousin Jody was left behind. Not because he didn't matter, but perhaps because someone didn't want him to. What he knew and what he left behind might have been more dangerous than anyone realized. And soon, the threads of this cover-up would start to unravel. The story of Cousin Jody's disappearance from public memory takes an even darker turn when you follow the money. In the years leading up to his death, Jody had reportedly been in contact with a young Nashville attorney who was helping several forgotten country artists reclaim lost royalties. That attorney, whose name was kept quiet at the time, later went on record in a private interview, never aired but recently uncovered, saying that Jody had come to him with a suitcase full of signed papers, old checks, and receipts that didn't make sense. According to him, Jody had discovered that for over a decade, someone else had been cashing in on his performances, syndicated reruns, merchandise sales, even audio compilations from early Opry shows. And worse, some of those payouts were going to a shell company listed under a name Jody didn't recognize. That's when the threats, allegedly, started. The attorney claimed that a week after they began their investigation, his office was broken into. Nothing was taken, but only one cabinet was opened, the one containing Jody's file. Then, the phone calls began, muffled voices warning him to drop the case. The lawyer said he confronted Jody, asking him if he knew what this was really about. And Jody's reply? "I signed too much, and I trusted the wrong people." This statement hit hard in hindsight. At the height of his fame, Jody had allegedly signed over several rights to his name, likeness, and even future performance royalties to a management firm that has since been dissolved. But the paperwork, some of which was recovered in recent years, shows a clear pattern of manipulation. The contracts were vague, full of legalese, and deeply one-sided. One clause even allowed the firm to reassign his assets in the event of non-communication, meaning if Jody became unreachable, they could legally assume he was no longer interested in collecting payments. Which, as we now know, is exactly what happened. Even more sinister is the discovery that his final known address, an aging trailer outside of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, was owned by a holding company connected to the same management group. Essentially, the very people who may have drained his career dry were also controlling where he lived. Witnesses described Jody in his last months as skittish, afraid of phones, and constantly watching the tree line. One neighbor even said she saw him burning papers in a rusted barrel behind the trailer just weeks before he passed. Was he trying to hide something? Or was he trying to destroy evidence before it fell into the wrong hands? Then came the most disturbing revelation. His death certificate lists no known relatives, and his body was cremated with no service, no memorial, and no next-of-kin signature. The official reason was to expedite the process. But local journalists have since questioned whether this was just another way to silence whatever secrets he may have carried to the grave. And yet, not everything was lost. In the next chapter of this mystery, a forgotten cassette tape surfaces from a pawn shop in Alabama, one that may contain Jody's final words. The cassette tape, discovered in the back room of a dusty pawn shop in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, sat in a box marked Opry Misc. It could have been tossed, forgotten forever. But the owner, a lifelong country fan, noticed the label, "Jody for my own head." Scribbled in shaky handwriting, it looked personal. Too personal to ignore. When played, what came through was a raw, unfiltered monologue. The voice was unmistakably Cousin Jody's, though older, more broken. He didn't sound like the wild-eyed performer audiences remembered. He sounded tired, paranoid, resigned. "This tape ain't for nobody but me," he begins. "But if someone finds it, maybe it's 'cause it was meant to be found." What follows is a 38-minute confession, not of crimes, but of betrayal, regret, and a creeping fear that someone had been watching him for years. Jody speaks of the contracts I signed when I didn't know better, and a man in a Cadillac who promised me security and took everything. He names no names, but refers often to the boys in the suits, describing how they took over his bookings, his likeness rights, and even rerouted his mail. One moment hits especially hard. "I didn't just lose money," he says, his voice cracking. "I lost who I was. They stopped calling, stopped booking me. I became the punchline to my own joke." He talks about being followed, a car he didn't recognize parked near his property for 3 nights in a row. Strange phone calls at odd hours. He says he stopped answering the door after dark. "I think they want me quiet," he mutters. "I think they're waiting for me to vanish." And then, Jody shares something even more shocking. A story about String Bean and Grandpa Jones. "We all knew something back then," he says. "After Bean was killed, Grandpa changed. He got quiet. He started looking over his shoulder, too." Jody implies that the same shadowy forces tied to his own exploitation may have had knowledge, if not involvement, in the tragic events that haunted the Opry. Near the end of the tape, Jody's tone shifts. He's no longer just afraid. He's angry. "If they find this tape," he says, "they'll probably say it's fake. But I don't care no more. I just want someone to know. I didn't disappear 'cause I gave up. I disappeared 'cause I got swallowed." And then silence. The pawn shop owner, stunned, contacted a local radio historian who authenticated the tape as genuine. The voice matched archival footage. The background noise, even the faint chirp of cicadas, matched Jody's known residence in Tennessee. But perhaps most compelling? The tape was dated just weeks before his death. Why would a man who seemingly had no family, no fortune, and no career left be so afraid? The mystery deepens, and with it, more puzzle pieces start to emerge. Because what Jody hinted at on that tape, it wasn't just about money. It was about an entire network in Nashville that had everything to lose if the truth came out. And in the next section, we uncover exactly what they were hiding. The fallout from Cousin Jody's secret cassette tape was immediate and unnerving. When the contents leaked to a small group of Nashville insiders, it wasn't just dismissed as the ramblings of a paranoid old man, it was buried. A prominent country music archivist who came forward to validate the voice suddenly walked back his claims. His social media accounts went dark. His blog, which had been active for over a decade, was wiped clean within 48 hours. People began whispering again. Had Jody been right? But then came the letter. Mailed anonymously to a local Tennessee journalist known for digging into Opry-era secrets, the envelope contained photocopies of financial statements, legal documents, and one handwritten note that simply read, "He wasn't crazy." The financial statements showed repeated withdrawals from Jody's personal accounts, often large sums, made by a management company that didn't seem to exist on paper. The legal documents were worse. One in particular was a power of attorney that gave control of Jody's estate to a man he'd only worked with briefly in the early 1980s, a man who was later connected to multiple lawsuits involving exploitation of elderly musicians. What started to take shape was a horrifying pattern. After Jody faded from the spotlight, he was still profitable. Reruns of Hee Haw, merchandise sales, even licensing of his name and image were generating money. But none of that money was reaching Jody himself. In fact, by the time of his death, his bank account had less than $600. His medical bills had been sent to collections. He'd been living in near poverty. Worse, the house he died in. It was no longer technically his. It had been quietly transferred years earlier through a shady shell company to a business that happened to be headquartered in the same building as one of Nashville's largest talent agencies. The same agency that once claimed to represent Jody's legacy. So what really happened? More and more, it looked like Jody hadn't just been forgotten. He'd been erased, squeezed for every dollar, silenced when he protested, and finally left to rot in obscurity while others profited. The man who once made millions laugh with his wacky hillbilly antics had been reduced to a name on a royalty check that someone else cashed. And yet, the tape survived. His voice survived. And now, after years of being dismissed and ignored, Cousin Jody's final words were finally being heard. In the next section, we'll reveal who the shadow figures really were. The names behind the management firm. The faces behind the betrayal. and the network that quietly profited off Jody's legacy while ensuring he never got the chance to expose them until now. The investigation reached a turning point when a former music industry assistant, known only as CL for her own protection, came forward with documents she claimed were pulled from a long-defunct Nashville PR firm's archive. The documents included internal memos, invoices, and most damning of all, a list titled Legacy Pipeline Tier C, which referenced deceased and near-deceased performers whose royalties could be redirected due to lack of active legal representation. Cousin Jody's name was right there on the list. According to CL, this firm wasn't operating alone. It worked in tandem with a small group of estate managers, copyright holding companies, and at least one law firm that specialized in talent asset liquidation, a euphemism for squeezing every last penny from artists with no living heirs or public profiles strong enough to trigger fan outrage. Jody, who never married and had no known children, was a perfect target. But it got even darker. CL alleged that Jody had once threatened to go public about the entire scheme, which, according to her, extended far beyond his case. Other vintage country acts, mostly minor Opry players or one-hit wonders, were being exploited similarly. When Jody tried to fight back, he suddenly found himself blacklisted from the very circuits that had once embraced him. Guest appearances dried up. Booking agents wouldn't return his calls, and the income that kept him afloat disappeared. At the time, Jody chalked it up to age and changing tastes, but now, with CL's testimony, a more chilling theory emerged. He'd been silenced, not by a gun or a threat, but by erasure. His worth, they decided, was higher as a nostalgic memory than a living, breathing man with stories to tell. They just needed him quiet. When he died in 1975, no national tribute aired. No memorial Opry segment. Just a quiet burial and a few passing mentions in trade publications. But CL's evidence proved that behind that silence was deliberate effort. One of the memos even referenced Jody's final days and included instructions on how to neutralize any unreleased statements. So, what exactly had Jody said? In a final twist, Cleo J also handed over a second tape, previously unheard and marked private, not for air. On it, Jody names names. He discusses meetings in Nashville boardrooms, calls from concerned friends, and one late-night drive where he says a stranger warned him to quit poking around or end up a ghost like the rest of them. Coming up next, we break down that second tape. Every name, every quote, and the moment Cousin Jody may have unknowingly signed his own death warrant. The contents of Cousin Jody's secret tape were chilling, not just because of what he said, but how he said it. His usual twangy humor was gone. His tone was somber, calculated. You could hear the weariness in his voice, the exhaustion of a man who had carried secrets for far too long. "They want you broke," he says at the start. "They want you quiet. They want you dead before you can make a fuss." He goes on to describe, in painstaking detail, what he called the Nashville Sweep, a coordinated effort by certain music business insiders to quietly cut off aging, troublesome artists from royalties and legacy tours. "They'll smile in your face at the Opry," he says on the tape, "then gut you like a catfish in a backroom contract." He names one specific publishing group, once partnered with a major label that handled dozens of catalog buyouts. The terms were always the same: low upfront payments, complicated legal language, and an agreement not to contest or revisit the deal. Jody explains how he was tricked into signing one such agreement when his health was declining in the late 60s. He thought he was agreeing to a royalty split for TV reruns of his Opry appearances, What he really signed was the transfer of all his performance and songwriting rights, permanently, for pennies on the dollar. "I'd been had," he says on the tape, "and I was too tired to fight." But then comes the most haunting part. About halfway through the tape, his voice drops to a whisper. He mentions that he tried reaching out to others in the same boat, String Bean's widow Estelle, a few old Opry musicians, and even Grandpa Jones. He says all of them were either scared off, silenced, or, in Estelle's case, murdered. He believed String Bean's killing wasn't just a robbery gone wrong, it was a warning. "That boy kept cash in the wall," Jody says. "But what he really had was a big mouth and a good memory. That's what got him killed." Jody even hints at a document he hid, a ledger containing payments made to him and others under the table, including discrepancies that proved royalties were being skimmed. He doesn't say exactly where it was, only that it was safe, close, and where nobody would think to look, especially not those thieves in the suits. The tape ends with a heartbreaking message. "If you're hearing this, I guess I didn't make it," he says. "Don't let them rewrite me. Don't let them win. Tell the truth. Tell them I saw it all." For decades, the industry wrote Cousin Jody off as a gimmick, a novelty, a side character in the story of country music. But this tape proved otherwise. He was a witness. He was a victim. And maybe, just maybe, he was about to become the key to exposing a system that robbed dozens of forgotten stars of their voices, their earnings, and their legacies. Coming up, what happened to that hidden ledger, and who risked everything to bring it to light? The search for Cousin Jody's hidden ledger became an obsession for one man, his great-nephew, Billy Ray Martin, a quiet former roadie who had stayed out of the spotlight his entire life. But when the cassette tape was found, Billy Ray said it lit a fire under him. He'd grown up hearing whispers of Jody's complaints, of shady contracts, of nights spent pacing around the house after hushed phone calls. And now, after hearing that tape, he knew Jody hadn't been paranoid. He had been right. Billy Ray began digging, starting with Jody's old trailer, long since abandoned and overgrown on the outskirts of Nashville. Most people assumed it was junk, but Billy knew better. He tore through the place board by board, searching behind walls, under floorboards, inside old banjo cases. For months, he found nothing but dust and rust. Then one day, tucked inside a hollowed-out section of the banjo's neck, yes, the banjo itself, Billy Ray found a rolled-up envelope sealed in wax. Inside, several pages of handwritten notes, receipts, contracts, and names. Some were scribbled in shorthand. Some were legible only under black light. But all of it pointed to one thing: systematic theft. The ledger detailed missing payments from major publishing houses, shows that were never reported, and checks that had supposedly been lost in the mail. Most damning of all was a list of names. Other artists from the Opry, hee-haw, and regional radio circuits who had similar deals. Many of them had died broke. Several had also died mysteriously. Billy Ray turned the documents over to a journalist from a regional paper, the only one brave enough to publish what they could verify. That story never made it to the major outlets. But behind the scenes, the industry took notice. Quiet settlements were issued, legal letters were sent, a few executives even retired early. What happened to Cousin Jody was no isolated incident. His final years were stripped of dignity, and his legacy nearly erased, not by time, but by the people who profited off his back. Thanks to that tape and the ledger, the truth is now out there. Cousin Jody died with a broken body, a faded spotlight, and barely enough money to cover his funeral. But he didn't go quietly. He left behind a trail, and now, decades later, the truth has finally caught up. The mystery of Cousin Jody's tragic end is no longer a mystery. And the truth? It isn't good.